The first morning began with the perfume of burnt espresso and rain on the window glass. The whole city grayed out as if the skyline had been erased and penciled back in by a tired hand. I arrived early, too early, because I wanted to see the office before it fully woke, before keyboards clacked and laughter drifted down the hallway, before anyone could decide who I was supposed to be. The security guard nodded. He had the soft eyes of someone who listened more than he spoke. The elevator hummed and carried me upward, quiet as a breath. On the 34th floor, the lights were dimmed, and the reception orchids leaned toward the windows as if asking for a different weather. The architectural models, white foam and pale wood, stood on their pedestals like rows of future promises. Somewhere, a cleaning crew finished a corridor and rolled away a scent of lemon and wet cloth. I set my umbrella on the marble, shook off the drops, and found my name written on a folded paper triangle at a glass desk, a placeholder in a field of placeholders. I did not sit right away. I placed my notebook on the desk, touched the spine with my thumb, and listened to the building's soft machinery breathe. A woman had used this desk before me. You could sense the outline of her habit in the way the chair had been adjusted, in the precise distance the monitor had been set back from the edge, in a shallow indent on the wooden pencil cup where a ring had tapped over and over during calls. The chair resisted when I lowered it, then gave in with a sigh. The desk smelled faintly of jasmine and printer paper. It is a trick of soft power, I have learned, to linger in the things we touch. By the time the office lit to full brightness, I had reviewed the orientation packet, mapped the faces from the org chart to the directory of headshots, and memorized the core phrases of the firm's creed. Vitality, restraint, a city made generous by the geometry of its buildings. I was the new executive operations director, the practical spine beneath the show muscle, but every article written about the firm over the last year led with a different detail, the same scandal. The CEO's marriage had ended, and with it, the departure of the firm's beloved COO. I had not come to replace a wife, I told myself. I had come to replace a leader. He arrived a few minutes past 8, bringing in with him crisp air and a dampness on his coat shoulders that darkened the wool. He had one of those faces everyone calls handsome because it is easier than admitting it makes them feel watched. A strong, quiet geometry, silver threaded through dark hair at his temples, eyes the color of slate. He stopped by my desk and introduced himself as if he were the one who had just been hired, as if the card on my desk had his name. He said mine once, slowly, like he was fitting each syllable into place. He said he was glad I'd arrived early. It meant I didn't need to be told about the pace here. He gestured down the corridor, told me to follow, and we moved past glass-walled conference rooms and framed awards. His stride was even. I matched it, counting the seconds between each heel and toe. We did not speak as we passed people who would become my team. They looked up with curiosity, then lowered their eyes because a new person is safest to view through glass, like an exhibit. A change management specialist, a strategy lead, an assistant who knew all the travel details that mattered. In his office, more glass, more books arranged by color as if the order of light mattered. He pointed me to a chair. The city fogged the floor-to-ceiling windows. He poured coffee into a small white cup and offered it to me wordlessly. When I shook my head, he did not insist. He had a way of letting silence sit in the room without rushing to fill it, a way of making the silence feel intelligent. He briefed me. He spoke in sentences with scaffolding, clear, spare, designed to hold weight. There was a public housing redevelopment the firm was leading pro bono, a speech to the city council next month about designing for dignity, a new hotel contract with a client who changed their mind the way some people change jackets. the COO had always managed the friction between ambition and the world. Without her, the sparks had landed where they shouldn't. The teams felt exposed, he said. Leadership was eyes and ears, not just hands. When he said the COO, his voice registered a pressure change. He did not say her name. He did not need to, because the hallway whispers would fill it in later. I nodded like I understood, and maybe understanding is only a posture the first week. He asked if I had any questions, and I asked 3 practical ones to prove I had listened. He smiled once, barely, at the 3rd question. He asked if I minded that he never closed his door. I told him I minded things that had to be explained. He said I would do fine here. The first week unfolded like an architectural drawing unrolled on a table, gridded, precise, and larger than I could hold with 2 hands. I learned where the printer jammed and how to unjam it without cutting a finger. I learned how long it took the elevators in the late afternoon and when to send a text instead of waiting. I learned the shorthand of initials and buildings and project codes. I noticed the jokes about the ex-wife always followed a careful pause, like touching a bruise to see whether it still hurt. A designer with heavy eyeliner leaned on my desk and told me, not unkindly, that the previous COO had been elegant, lethal, perfect. She meant it as both compliment and warning. She studied my clothes, the plain black dress, the watch with its thin leather strap. She asked what perfume I wore. I said none. She nodded like this was a test passed. At home, my apartment was smaller than it had been in the rental listing, the walls closer together now that I wanted a room to be quiet enough for me to hear my own thoughts. I ate standing in the kitchen, the refrigerator's motor a steady white noise, and fell asleep with my laptop open on a table beside a cup gone cold. On Friday, rain again. The city cinched the gray belt tighter around itself, and I worked late to figure out why 2 budgets didn't reconcile. The office emptied, lights clicked off at the edges. Jazz drifted from someone's phone in a nearby studio, a saxophone line like a voice from another life. I was halfway through the spreadsheets when I realized the scent on my wrist. Not mine. Impossible. I had worn nothing but present, jasmine and paper. I lifted my wrist, breathed, looked around. No one. The scent clung to the chair back, the desk drawers. For a second I saw her hands on the keyboard, her ring tapping, and the reflex to imitate rose in me unbidden. I sat straighter. I smoothed my hair. To inhabit a role is to find the grooves cut by the person before and let them guide your trajectory. While the rain tapped the glass, I asked myself what part of me wanted to occupy that carved-out space, and what part wanted to carve my own. He returned from a meeting around 9, his tie loosened half an inch, and his sleeves folded once at the wrist. He stood at the edge of the light thrown by my lamp, and the room felt smaller by a measurable degree. He asked if I always worked with jazz playing. I told him it wasn't mine. He listened to the melody for a moment and said that jazz reminded him of blueprints, the way a plan is both constraint and improvisation. He asked if I'd solved the budget discrepancy. I said almost. We stood at my desk shoulder to shoulder, and he leaned in to read a column, and the cold scent of rain in his coat lifted. The proximity held its own charge, careful and bright. He did not touch me. He did not need to for the air to notice him. We did not flirt. That is what I told myself. We did the more elegant thing. We tried to speak each other's language. He talked about scale and proportion. I mirrored with timelines and dependencies. He asked what I thought the team feared most right now. I said irrelevance, then corrected myself to say being taken for granted, because isn't that the fear behind most rebellions? He looked at me for an extra second after that. He said the previous COO had once written on a whiteboard, "Everything counts, even the way we staple." And before I could say anything, he shook his head once, as if to apologize for bringing her into the room. The rain deepened. The jazz fell away to a hush, as if the building itself were listening. He said my name again, slowly placed, and told me to go home. I said I would when the numbers stopped fighting. 2 weeks later, we left for a conference 2 cities away, the kind with carpet that drinks up sound and lanyards that try to domesticate people into categories. It was his first public talk since the divorce. The speech draft we had prepared was not about marriages or endings. It was about civic tenderness and steel. He practiced in his head, I could tell, because he would smile at nothing as we walked down a hallway, as if discovering how to say a sentence without the word he'd first planned. On the flight, he reviewed notes while I adjusted the order of slides, swapping the photo of a quiet courtyard into the place where he usually showed a tower. He glanced at me and nodded like he'd agreed to be edited. In the hotel elevator, we descended with 3 other executives in their conference best, all trying to look like they'd never made a mistake bigger than a misplaced comma. He stood close because there was nowhere else to stand. The elevator hummed down. The air smelled faintly of lemon and someone's cologne, warm and expensive. He spoke in a low voice without turning his head, asking if I'd adjusted his schedule, if he was being protected from the people who did not want to wish him well. I told him yes, because efficiency sometimes looks like affection from the outside. He said thank you in a tone that had more warmth in it than the word required. After the talk, which he delivered with the restraint of a person who trusts the audience to lean in, there was a reception. The room filled with the tinkle of ice against glass, with praise designed to pass as insight. A woman with perfect hair told him she had adored his ex-wife, that she had been the soul of the firm. Then she glanced at me in a way that made a calculation, and the calculation showed on her face before she could decide to hide it. I excused myself to take a call and found an empty hallway where the carpet muted my footsteps and the wall lighting smoothed the edges of everything. I leaned my head against the cool glass and let my breath find its way back to its right speed. When I returned, he was at the edge of the room speaking softly to a city official who was telling him how to win a bid without looking like he wanted it too much. His hand, as he listened, moved to adjust his cuff, a gesture so practiced it felt like a habit he used to think. I felt the strange sensation of seeing a man I worked for as a man, of a life past work, of a morning at home with light in it, of a bowl for keys and the decision to learn to make a new kind of coffee because someone else had preferred it. This is how desire arrives when you are not looking. It steps into your line of sight wearing a small ordinary moment. Back at the hotel, the elevator stalled between floors for a count of 12, a heartbeat times 12. And in that pause I heard 2 separate sounds from him. The steady inhale of someone who refuses to connect small malfunctions to larger disasters, and the tiny exhale of relief when the car moved again. It is hard to love someone who performs calm for everyone else. It is harder not to. A rumor began 2 days after we returned. It moved with the speed of electricity, painless in its travel, scorching where it landed. Someone said confidential numbers had been seen by someone who should not have seen them. Someone suggested that in our careful adjustments to the hotel slides, we had left a trace of something proprietary in the metadata, a breadcrumb trail lit by boredom and too much time. The rumor moved fast because it fit a shape that already existed. A narrative about a firm unmoored by a divorce, about a new hire who was a shadow of the old order, about desire expressed as miscalculation. HR called me in with the softness that always makes the skin prickle. They asked me to walk them through the trip, to hand over my laptop for an hour so they could do the things people do in quiet rooms with software and a checklist. I said yes because it was easiest. I told them where we had been in the hotel, and when I had adjusted slides, and that we had eaten in the restaurant with the glass partitions. The HR lead wrote it down with a pen that whispered on the paper. She asked how close we were. I said we were colleagues who knew how to stand near each other without making a mess of things. He did not call me that day. I did not look at my phone any less. When he finally asked me to come to his office, he was standing at the window without pretending to see anything. He asked me very quietly if I had known his ex-wife. I told him only from articles and the ghost of her decisions. He asked if I wore jasmine. I said I wore nothing. He nodded as if that confirmed something, then told me the rumor would burn itself out with the facts. Facts are not fireproof, but I did not say that. He told me the worst thing, that he had hired me because I was nothing like her. He said it in a voice that held both gratitude and apology. He said she had been elegant, lethal, and perfect. Yes, he used the same 3 words that eyeliner designer had used. And for a second I thought people are not creative when it comes to speaking about what they long for and fear. He told me he'd thought a presence like mine might ask different questions of the firm. And then he told me the other worst thing, that in small ways, in the way I held a pen, in the way I paused before interrupting him, in the way I touched the edge of the desk when a call went too long, I had begun to look like her. I did not say that the desk still smelled of her. I did not say that I had found a forgotten lipstick in the bottom drawer the first week. A rectangle of muted rose, the color of a promise you could deny. I did not say that power leaves fingerprints on the furniture. Instead, I said that roles invite repetition, and sometimes we step into a choreography already blocked. He closed his eyes for a count of 2 as if calibrating, then opened them and said my name in the same careful way he always did. He said he did not want to do this again, not in the old dance steps, not with silence in place of care. He said he would not ask me to be anyone's ghost. The investigation concluded in 3 days. The leak had been nothing of the size they'd feared. A comment overheard, repeated, embellished. A spreadsheet printed and left near the copier where a visitor could see a column header and make a guess. A story that had grown an appetite and then fed itself. But something had shifted anyway. The designer with heavy eyeliner apologized by leaving a cup of tea on my desk without a note. The team moved around me as if the floor had an extra layer of lacquer. He kept his door open, but when he asked me to come in, he gestured to the chair farther from his desk than before. The shift made me angry. Not at the firm or at HR. At the invisibility of the labor women do to keep things from falling apart, to keep the story of the place intact even as the people in it break. I thought of his ex-wife, no longer a role but a woman, and of the way elegance becomes a uniform, a shield that turns worry into a kind of shine. I thought of how easy it would be to dissolve into shapes other people have left behind and call it professionalism. The night after the rumor ended, I stayed late to finish a vendor negotiation that had been suffering from too many cooks. The building was a quiet body again. A storm rang a knuckle on the windows. I walked to the kitchen for water and found him there, sleeves rolled, tie loosened, looking at the dark as if it had asked him a question. He did not startle when I stepped in. He smiled, not the polite politician's smile, but the small involuntary lift that said he recognized the outline of me even when the lights were down. We spoke about ordinary things first. The municipal contract. The printer that jammed only for people it did not like. The fact that I had convinced a contractor to knock off 5% without ever saying the number. He told me he admired the way I created calm without making it a performance. He told me that when he watched me run a meeting, he felt less sorry for himself afterwards. I told him I appreciated that particular, unflattering compliment. There was a bottle of sparkling water between us on the counter, the dull green catching the recessed light. He reached for it. I reached for it. Our fingers touched, only for a second, the barest brush of skin. No dramatics, no gasp. Just the fact of warmth where there had been none. Something in me took a step closer, invisible but real. I don't want to become her, I said, and it surprised me that I said it out loud, that I used the present tense. He answered without moving his hand. I don't want that either, he said, and I believed him. I hired you because the way you look at a problem is a kind of kindness. She and I were not kind. We were effective. It's not the same. The building's mechanical hum filled the space. The elevator cables thrummed like a bass note. Rain made its human tapping sound. You're allowed to have a life, he said. We both are. And what happens if that life intersects with work? I asked, careful, the words balanced on a narrow ledge. He drew in a breath, held it for a small count, let it go. Then we decide. Not once. Not dramatically. Every day, in the small angles. We stood there a little longer. We did not step into each other's arms. We did not pretend we were not in a room that belonged to other people's expectations. We returned to our desks, the way adults with complicated hearts do. But on my way out, past the orchids leaning toward what they could not reach, he walked with me to the elevator. When the doors slid shut, he did something he had never done. He placed his hand at the small of my back, not possessively, not for balance, just a point of warm emphasis, as if to say, here you are, delineated, and I see you. The weeks that followed made a rhythm we could live in. We were cautious, and also, in small ways, generous. He asked me for input on things he'd once handled alone. I told him when I thought his minimalism in speeches felt like evasion. We sat together with the public housing team and refined a presentation until the language held dignity without decoration. The designer with the heavy eyeliner stopped by my desk each morning and offered a comment on my jacket like a seal of truce. When he and I had to travel again, we took separate flights, on purpose. We understood optics. We also understood what it meant to choose a thing rather than drift into it. Spring edged into the city. The rain warmed. People spilled onto sidewalks and looked up from their screens. The firm won the hotel contract with a proposal that had, in its middle, a courtyard designed less for photos and more for the sound trees make at dusk. His city council speech became an op-ed. Our phones buzzed in the same minute. He read my draft, I read his edits, and the hybrid voice we had built together felt like a third thing. Neither his nor mine, but belonging to both of us without claiming either. One evening, too late for colleagues, too early for ghosts, I found a small package on my chair. Inside, a new notebook, not the brand she had used. The paper had a faintly deckled edge, an imperfection you could feel. No note, only the object. I looked up to see him in his office, watching the sky half-heartedly turn the color of a bruise that would heal. I lifted the notebook for him to see. He tilted his head half an inch, a yes. I knew suddenly that the gift was not the notebook, but the refusal to make it mean too much. The night that could have been the night was a night like any other until it wasn't. A summer storm lifted itself on the horizon and came in with theater. The office shook its shoulders. The city lights smeared on the wet glass. We had stayed to review a crisis communications plan for a contractor caught in a PR snarl not of his making. We had done the math, the messaging, the choreography of accountability. Almost done, Not quite. My hand on the mouse, his hand on the back of my chair, the nearness infused with all the hours we had not used as a bridge. He told me about the morning he realized his marriage was over. He did not tell it like a story. He told it like a room he had walked into and then out of again. We stopped being kind, he said. We thought competence could stand in for gentleness. She was brilliant. I was exacting. We were very good at being admired. I did not know how to need anything. His voice did something I had not heard before. It roughed. He looked at the skyline that was now only the shape of light through water. I don't know how to need anything without making it a system. I told him the truth about my own life. That I had been, for too long, the person other people leaned on to avoid the consequences of their choices. That I liked making systems because systems promised the kind of safety people could not. That I had moved to this city for a version of work that would not ask me to fade at the edges. That sometimes I worried I was only the shape of my usefulness. He took a small step closer, not enough to break any rule but enough to warm the air between us. You are not a shape I've seen before, he said. It was the plainest thing he could have said, and it was the most beautiful. We did not kiss. The storm darkened, then passed. The world returned to its normal palette, as if embarrassed by its own drama. He walked me to the elevator. We stood in that hum again. He did not touch me this time. We were careful. We were also not lying to ourselves. The crisis arrived in another form, cleaner, sharper. A board member who adored the ex-wife and distrusted everything since sent an email to the entire leadership team, thinly veiled, and I could feel the shape of it rolling toward us like a cart with a wobbly wheel. The email suggested we were drifting from the firm's core values. It implied moral laxity and strategic confusion, and ended with a sentence that looked like concern but sounded like accusation. I read it twice and thought of the quiet ways women are asked to carry the tone of a place on their backs. He forwarded it with a single line to me. Would you like to respond first? I wrote my reply and did not ask him to edit it. I wrote about restraint and generosity, about the choice to lead with dignity when spectacle would be easier, about how systems either center people or they don't. I wrote a sentence that had been forming in me for weeks. That mercy in design looks like doors that open for the person carrying a bag and a crying child at the same time. I signed my name with all my syllables. I could no one extra. I pressed send. Silence, then applause, the quiet kind that moved through the building like heat through a vent. The board member sent a note that said, I appreciate the clarity, followed by a line break that contained all the unhappy he was not yet finished with. The ex-wife called him that evening, not about me, not about us, because there was no me and us to call about, but because the firm had been their child, and you do not stop calling about a thing you once made. I watched him speak in a tone composed of past and present balanced on an edge. He said he was well, that the firm was well. He said he wished her the same. After the call he came to my office and stood in the doorway. He did not cross it. He praised my email in a way that did not turn me into a weapon. He told me there were days he didn't know how to be a different kind of leader from the one he had been. He told me that when he didn't know, he watched what I did with the room. He said thank you, and I understood the word held more freight than the 2 syllables could carry. The closest we came to intimacy was not a night. It was a morning. The city had lifted itself into a clear day, all windows rinsed, all leaves shocked into brightness. I arrived at the office to find him boxing up the things on his shelves, rearranging, not leaving. He held a book in his hand that looked older than the rest, its spine rubbed dull from touch. He asked if I had a moment. He told me he wanted to move the books around, to break the color gradient that had always pleased him because it was too neat. He wanted the shelves to look like thinking, not like display. He asked if I would help him decide where to start. We worked in small silence. He handed me a book. I found a place for it. The jazz from the studio down the hall lifted into the air. He stood on a step stool to reach the higher shelves. I handed him titles and breathed in the warm paper scent that fills rooms where people write their own maps. At one point he climbed down, brushed the dust from his hands, and our shoulders came close. I felt the awareness again, the unspectacular miracle of two lives making room for each other. And in that moment, there was nothing else to do but acknowledge it. "This is the place," he said quietly, where I almost say the wrong thing. I looked at the shelf instead of him. "Then say the right thing," I said, equally quiet. He did not say "I love you," because he did not yet, not in the way that word deserves. He did not say "I need you," because we had taught ourselves to refuse that formulation. He said, "I want to keep making choices that leave us both room to breathe." It sounded like a contract written in the time before lawyers. I nodded, my throat a little tight. "Then let's keep making them." If there was a night we allowed more, it arrived at the pace of a human decision, not an accident. We had presented the public housing plan to the city council. The vote had passed. People in the room had clapped in a way that seemed to include their earlier skepticism inside the applause, as if to admire themselves for changing their minds. We returned to the office late. The skyline glowed like a wound healed to a scar. He stood by the window while I packed my bag. He said, without turning, that he was ready to have dinner somewhere that wasn't a lobby. He said it like a proposal that understood risk. I said yes because yes carried more integrity than maybe. At the restaurant, a quiet one, no photographs on the walls to make conversation work harder. We spoke about ordinary things in a way that made them luminous. We did not talk about the ex-wife. We did not talk about the rumor. We talked about building shade where summer would find people standing in lines. We talked about the way elevators make strangers into temporary intimates. He asked what my mother had taught me about work. I told him to leave places better than I found them, including myself. He told me his father had taught him to put tools back exactly where he found them, and that he was only now learning how to misplace certain tools on purpose. When we walked out, the night had turned soft. He did not reach for my hand. I did not offer it. We stood by the curb and let cars pass until the silence between us was warm enough to step into. When he leaned, finally he gave me time to decline. I did not. The kiss was not a performance. It was an exhale releasing 2 months of carefulness. The city smelled like rain's memory and new bread. Somewhere a siren wound down, polite, and left us alone. The night faded around us, leaving only breath and promise. The next morning, the building was the building, the orchids were the orchids, and we were 2 adults who had taken a step into the room we had been circling. We made a plan because plans are how people like us protect what they want. We would not touch in the office. We would let the team see leadership strengthened rather than distracted. We would tell HR together before anyone else could draw their own shaky arrows. We would not become a repetition of what had been before, not because we were better, but because our shapes were different and we had decided to honor them. Months later, the firm settled into a quiet season of output. The hotel broke ground with a ceremony that avoided shovels painted gold. The public housing project erected its first beams. The designer with the eyeliner adopted a dog and brought in photos once a week, as if the dog were a project she expected review on. The HR lead smiled when she passed me in the hallway, The way people smile when the story you feared would define you has been replaced by work everyone can point to and call good. His office shelves lost their color order and gained a logic that changed with the day. My desk no longer smelled like jasmine. It smelled like paper and graphite, and my own hand cream, faint and citrus. The chair held the shape of me and of the hours I'd made in it. Sometimes he would pass my desk and we would not speak, because the right language for a moment is to acknowledge and keep going. Sometimes in a meeting, our eyes would find each other across a table with water rings on it, and he would tilt his head 1 degree, and I would understand that this was how care worked in public. We did not rush. We were not lovers who mistook urgency for depth. We built the thing we had decided to build. We disagreed beautifully. He learned to need without making it a system. I learned to allow my usefulness to be a part of me rather than the whole. The ex-wife was not a ghost. She was a person living a life somewhere else, perhaps adjusting her own books by color in a room with good light, perhaps choosing a different perfume. Sometimes a small ache passed through me, a sympathetic ache for a woman I had never met. A recognition of the cost of holding the shape of an institution and being asked to be gracious while doing it. When that ache visited, I let it sit, then let it go. Kindness, like design, is a discipline. On the last evening of summer, the city leaned into a gold that made strangers look like they belonged. The office emptied early. The jazz from down the hall was playful and distracted. I finished a last email, turned off the lamp, and stood to leave. He appeared at my doorway, his tie loosened, his expression unguarded in a way that had become familiar. We rode the elevator down together without touching. On the ground floor, in the quiet that concrete and glass make at dusk, he paused with me by the revolving doors and smiled, not with his mouth, but in the softening around his eyes. Choice, not chance, he said. Every day, I answered. We stepped into the evening. The office lights behind us dimmed one by one, but his shadow, in the long pane of glass, lingered near mine. We walked toward the corner where the city waits to carry people home, and our hands found each other not because the world required proof, but because the space between us had learned our names.